So the first thing you guys need to understand when it comes to policy making, public policy making. Now, in the very first webinar we had, when we discussed about political parties, we learned that political parties make policies, and policies means what they would do if they have power, right? So when it comes to policy making, it is a matter of the government approaching the problems people have to solve them, right? Now, if you guys are the citizens of a country, and if I am running for presidential election, I would have a policy paper. Now, what does a policy paper mean? A policy paper means that basically my agenda, my program as to what to do in case if I have power. Those are the policies. Now, when it comes to this policy process, there is a huge process that they make policies and how they implement the policies to address the problems people have. And in this lesson, we are going to look at that. Now, if you take a look at this, you can break down this lesson into three main areas. Okay, you can break it down to three main areas. That way, it's easier for you to keep track. Okay. Basically, this is what you need to memorize. When it comes to the public policy lesson, this is what you need to memorize, right? You can break down the lesson into three main areas. First, we have to study the theoretical aspect, right? Under that, you have to define what public policy is. You have to study about the policy formation cycle or the circle, right? There's a circle for policy formation, just like that conflict life cycle we studied about. Then you have the practical aspect. You have to study how different institutes, political institutes, take part in this policy formation process. And the last part of this unit is there's a person called Max Weber. If you all have come across this name in the political science syllabus before, it is a matter of studying what his views are on policy, on public policy. This person explained what is a bureaucracy and what features should be there, and we should be studying about that. Right. Now, when it comes to policy formation, the note I have sent you all in the beginning, there are a couple of interpretations, definitions as to what policy formation is. So basically, public policy formation is a process where the government approaches the problems the public has, people have, in order to solve those problems. Okay, so the public policy as a topic in political science does not have a really long history. Now, compared to other concepts in political science, we normally study things like democracy, liberalism. These things are centuries old. Democracy goes way back to ancient Greece, like 3,000, 4,000 years back. And even things like liberalism and all, at least they're like a couple of 100 years old as concepts. But comparing to that, public policy as a concept, it came to political science very late, especially after the 20th century. It doesn't even have 1 century back in terms of history. Now, policy formation means, as I told you, the government approaching the problems people have in order to solve them. Now, I explained to you all that the state did not get problems of citizens in the earlier stages of liberalism. That was known as classic liberalism, the classic liberal era. So during the classic liberal era, the state did not get involved in um, public issues. Okay, so the state, in fact, started getting involved in solving people's problems was in the second era of liberalism. That was the modern liberal era, where there was welfare state system in action. Okay, so then only that this public policy system became important. Now, under classic liberalism, the state did not get involved in it, right? Which means that the state did not really have any actual work to do. Give me a second. Since the state was simply handling law and order, they weren't approaching people's problems, so they did not want anyone. And in the second stage of liberalism, when welfare state came into action, when the state started getting involved in people's affairs, people's problems, they needed a staff to carry out whatever they decide. Now, for example, I explained to you that in the beginning, people weren't really taken care by the state. So poor people had to stay poor, where rich people experienced everything. So under modern liberalism, if rich kids go to a private school by spending money, the state would create government schools where the state would provide education to students who are in need. Now, the state wanting to provide welfare service to the public like that won't occur out of thin air, right? That means if the state wants to provide welfare services, there has to be someone to carry that out towards the public. That's when the state needed manpower. That's when the state needed a staff. Then only we created this entire system called the permanent executive, or as the public sector. You guys have heard things called like the government jobs, that I'm working in a government job and all that, the public sector jobs. So it was with modern liberalism that the state started recruiting people, employing people as their servants, state sector, public sector servants, to carry out the decisions of the public. Right? And all these people who are working for government institutes, what they are doing is they are helping the state to carry out their decisions to the public. If Gotabaya Rajapaksa decides to give let's say fertilizers to farmers, or like free fuel for fishermen to run their boats, or something like that. The Gotabaya Rajapaksa as the president deciding that is pointless, because he himself can't go and give fertilizers to every farmer. That's why you need like a public sector. For that you call the permanent executive. Okay, and then only this public sector became important, and following that, the public policy became an important point. Okay, right. Are you guys having? Can you guys properly hear me and see me? Is there like? Is there a connection issue?
Yes, no.
I'm clear, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you need to go back to 1930s to exactly understand when did public policy come to the spotlight. That's when the public policy came to the spotlight in 1930s. Have you guys heard of the Great Depression? I'm not talking about the fact that you all have to do A-levels in another 1 year or 2 years. That is the Great Depression for you all at the moment, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the Great Depressions USA had to go through, right? So following the First World War in 1920s and 30s, USA faced like a economic downturn because they weren't very used to fighting wars, and after the First World War, after US involvements, the economy sort of crashed, and the unemployment and everything like skyrocketed. A lot of people went into poverty. So USA was struggling financially really bad in 1930s. During that time, USA had a president called Herbert Hoover, right? Herbert Hoover. So President Hoover was a smart person. So he came up with several financial plans to make sure that US economy stays put, right? But the problem was that this plan of Mr. Hoover did not really take on. It was a really good plan on paper, but in practicality, it was not effective. It was not productive. So political scientists everywhere realized that, okay, you know what? State doing something, the government deciding, making a decision is not enough. There has to be a proper way for that to reach the people. And apparently there is a missing link somewhere, right? So they started doing research to find out what is this missing link, why are these decisions are not coming through to the public from the government. And that's when public policy in fact became a prominent area in political science, right? So if you all ever get an MCQ with this statement, like, public policy making became an important part after American political scientists trying to find the missing link, that statement is correct, right? If you go through that note, if you manage to read that handwriting, you will see that, right? And also in the first lesson, you can see a couple of definitions also, right? Let's not waste time those definitions at the moment, right? So let's move on to the next one because we have limited time. And in this note, as you can see, these are the definitions. And if there is a word that's hard for you to read, you can drop me a text and ask. Right. Now, this is the next important part. This is something you need to take note. Studying public policy. There are two methods to study public policy. These are the things they ask for, like, what do you call it? Short questions in the first paper. There are 10 short questions, 20 short questions, right? For those, they ask these kind of questions. What are the two methods to study public policy? Now you can see there's one called study of policy and the other one is study in policy. Okay. Study of policy is read as, if you can read what's there. This is a study of elements such as the conditions that make the public policy successful or not, methods to include public policy agenda, etc. The second one is study in policy. This is basically a study of methods to implement a policy successfully. Now, just to put this into simpler terms for your advantage. Study of policy is basically looking at the creation of policies. The creation of policies, right? Study in policy means studying the practical implementation of policies. The first one is basically you are trying to figure out how can you make a policy. Second one is basically trying to figure out how can you practically implement what you just created. Understand? Right? So mostly study of policy is done by people like us. What do you mean people like us? Students, political science students, right? Study in policy is done by people who are like professionally involved in the policy making process, right? However, it must be mentioned that in the study of public policy, these two aspects are closely related. Now, you can't completely exclude yourself from thinking about the practical implementation and solely focus on the creation. Neither you can never only think about the creation and not think about how this will be practically implemented at one point, right? These two are closely related, and that also should be known, right? Then there's a small note about the purpose of studying public policy, which is very practical. This, I'm not sure whether you all can read this. This is like a scanned version of that note. If you all want to jot down, I'll tell you. Basically, this the top says concepts related to public policy, right? You all may note these down. I think that would be much easier. So basically, it says there are three main concepts related to public policy. As you can see, the first one, as you can see, keyword I don't think you can see, right? First one is policy analysis. First one is policy analysis. Second one is policy advice. Third one is policy leadership. Okay. Policy analysis, policy advice. Third one is policy leadership. Right. Now these three you need to understand. This is very straightforward if you think it practically. So as a student, what do you do? Now imagine you guys are like intellectual people, like very brainy intellectual university professors and all that, and I am the president of the country. And you guys are like all these university lecturers, intellectuals and well-respected, reputed people in the country. Okay. So as a leader, I am going to have my policies, and I need to have like a public policy making process to make sure that my decisions actually reach the public. Okay. Then what would be the first thing for you to do according to those three concepts we talked? Policy analysis. So as the intellectuals, what you all would do first is that you all would be analyzing my policies. So that's number one, policy analysis, right? Then after analyzing, what do you all do? When you all figure out what I'm doing wrong, that's number two, policy advice. You come and advise me. This is how you should be doing, right? And what if that I am not capable of picking those up still, even after advice? Then you all need to give me the leadership that I need, policy leadership. Or else that I can myself take the policy leadership and help my ministers and everyone say, I am taking policy leadership in terms of the policy making process. I am taking the leadership. Right? Very straightforward. Quite straightforward. Right. Which brings us to the next one. Next lesson, which is the policy process. Okay. So before we start policy process, if you guys have any questions, you all can ask. Then we are getting into the cycle of policy process. Any questions, guys? I think it's pretty straightforward. Right. If you take a look at the note, it says, right, policy process is a cycle that emerges by searching for solutions for current common issues based on historical activities of the government. Also, of the government. Okay. Also, revising common issues in the present is also a featured exercise that creates better and conclusive policies, right? Then it explains the names of these two people. these two people, James Lester and Joseph Stewart. James Lester and Joseph Stewart are the two people who came up with this policy process, the cycle of policy process. Okay. If you go through the teacher's guide, you all can see another picture of this. So there are certain steps of this cycle of policies. First, you have, it starts from here. The first one is agenda setting. Step 1 is agenda setting. Step 2, policy formation. Step 3, policy implementation. Step 4, policy evaluation. Step 5, policy revision. Step 6, policy termination. Right? Following that in the note, you can see a small explanation of each of these steps. Now I will give you the basic idea. You all may jot down. Right. So what's the first step of this cycle? Agenda setting. Now, as if we go back to the previous example, if I am the leader of the country, if I am a president, I should have an agenda in terms of what I should be doing in terms of my policies, right? So that's called agenda setting. Before anything else, I have to have my agenda. This is what I'm going to do in terms of my policy. That's my agenda. Agenda setting is number 1. Then you move on to policy formation. Now that I have my agenda sorted, I can proceed to the next stage, which is forming the policy, creating the policy, formation of policy. So you formulate the policies according to the problem and according to my plans, and that is the second step. And once the policy formation is done, you can move on to the next step. If the policy is done, what do you do? The creation of the policy is done. Then of course the next one is policy implementation. So you implement that to see whether it reaches the question. So you implement the policy and address the problem through the policy. Okay. So after the implementation is done, then what is the next step? Then you have policy evaluation. So you have to evaluate how the policy has done, whether the problem is solved, whether the problem has ignored, avoided certain areas, whether it has neglected certain areas, has it faced any practical issues, how successful this has been. You can take the statistics into consideration, like how it was before, how it was after, right, and all that. Then you have a policy revision. After you take the policy evaluation reports, you take all the policy evaluation reports and you revise that. You revise that in order to understand what policies have been ineffective, what policies have been effective. Then you come to the last stage, which is policy termination. If there are policies that have been unsuccessful, you terminate those policies. Then you come back to agenda setting and you set the agenda and you form the policies again. You implement them. Then you evaluate them. Then you revise them and you terminate whatever that's not. And you are back to agenda setting. That's the cycle of policy making. Right. Any questions there? In general, I take some time and explain all these. As I always say, these webinars are very limited time and I have to cover the entire unit, so I'm just going ahead. In the future, I'll be explaining these more in my classes. Right. If you understand that part, now if you come back to this, if you come back to our map. If you come back to the map we created to figure out how to go through this unit. If you understood that part, then you can see the first part, the theoretical aspect is sorted. Right? We have defined our public policies, we know the background, and we studied the policy formation, policy process cycle. And we studied about the concept, the 3 concepts related to policies, which means the first aspect is done. Okay, that's pretty much it. we had time, we could have gone into detail and explain further. But the theoretical aspect is done, which means we can move on to the practical aspect. How different institutions take part in the policy formation process. Now, policy formation and policy making, this process is done by political authorities, and several political authorities have different types of duties and tasks in terms of this process, right? So you all can write these down. This actually looks like one of those are when the doctors write prescriptions, right? This actually looks like a doctor's prescription. I'm really sorry, guys. This was the only copy I could find. Till I contact the typist somehow. I feel bad for the typist actually, whoever's typing this. Right. Anyhow, you all may jot down the political institutions that we are going to study when it comes to practical aspect. First of all, the three institutions in the government: legislature, executive, judiciary, right? If there are students who have missed the basic lessons and who aren't very clear with what executive, what legislature, what judiciary is, you all won't understand exactly, but just try your best to pick, and I'll try to give it in the simplest way possible. If there are any people like that, just drop me a DM and arrange a class with me, join one of my revision classes where I'll be covering all these basics from the beginning, from the first lesson itself, right? So anyhow, there are legislatures, executive, judiciaries in the system, and we need to see what sort of a role they play. Not only that, then you have the fourth one. If you can read, you can see one is legislature, two is executive. Within brackets, I asked him to write political. I asked to write legislature number one, number two executive. Within brackets, it should be political executive, but I don't really think he has written political. And number three, judiciary. And the fourth one is a star where it says permanent executive, right? The permanent executive is also known as the public sector. It has an important duty in the policy process. Okay. So permanent executive is the fourth political institution we need to study. That means like the public sector, the government, authorities and all, right? And other than that, we need to study about the role of political parties and the role of the civil society as well. Executive, legislature, judiciary, permanent executive, political parties, and civil society, right? Those are the political institutions we are looking into, what sort of a role they have in terms of the policy process, right? So first, we need to take a look at the role of the legislature. Okay. Now, the ones who aren't familiar with the concept of legislature and the ones who know the role but still aren't really comfortable with the lesson, I will basically explain how the lawmaking process works, right? So the governments are there to make laws. That's the job of the government, making laws. Okay. So the government has three institutions called executive, legislature, and judiciary. Executive means the president and the ministers and everyone who are making decisions. When I say ministers, they are different from members of the parliament. The members of the parliament in charge of making decisions, who's a part of the cabinet. Okay. So this is the earlier lessons, the basics. I'm just briefly explaining for anyone who's not aware of this. Right. So the president and the ministers are the decision makers. That's why we call them the executive. So they make decisions. That's why we see Gotabaya Rajapaksa and these other ministers making decisions and coming to media and saying, we decided to do this, we decided to do that, and all. So when they make decisions, they can't execute their decision, they implement their decisions right after they make the decision. That's not how it works in the government. They have to put that to the legislature and get it approved. Okay. That's the task of a legislature, a parliament. That's why you have a parliament in a country. The executive makes a decision. President and the ministers make a decision, and then that decision has to be approved in the parliament. Okay. Then only it becomes a law. Then once that is a law, right? And if that is a law, the judiciary makes sure that it is followed by people, and if anyone breaks that, they are punished by the judiciary. And if it is a decision as we made, like a public policy sort of a decision that something needs to be done instead of a law, the permanent executive, what we talked about, the public sector, the government workers, they carry that out. Now, if I give you an example, let's say Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his ministers, as the executive of Sri Lanka, they decide to ban ban plastic products. Okay, some like certain plastic products. Okay, let's say they ban plastic bottles. They make it compulsory for you to carry steel or glass bottles or something like that. Right? So now that is a law, which means the moment Gotabaya decides, okay, you know what? I think we need to outlaw plastic bottles, and it's not going to function straight away. It's not going to get into action straight away. He has to put it to the parliament, and the parliament has to approve it, which means members of the parliament take a vote, and the majority should vote for Gotabaya's decision. Then on it becomes a law. And after that, what the judiciary, the third wing, does is they wait, they check if anyone violates that law. If anyone violates that law, the judiciary punishes them. And if Gotabaya makes a public policy sort of a decision, let's say the Gotabaya decides, okay, you know what, I am going to give a tab or a smartphone to every student who's doing O levels or A levels for them to have online classes, right? Now, again, that won't function straight away right after Gotabaya says. That has to be approved in the parliament. And once it is approved in the parliament, there the judiciary does not have to do anything because it's something the government is trying to do. Then once it is approved, it goes to the public sector, the permanent executive, the government workers, where they will have to make the order, bring tabs and go from village to village and find who are the students and give them the tabs and do the paperwork and all. So they are the ones who are carrying the task. Right. So in this task, in this process, let's see what sort of a role the legislature has. First things first, when it comes to the legislature in terms of this policy formation, policy process, they used to have a big role in it. They used to have like a really big role in it. Because they were the ones who approved. President and the ministers could decide anything, but it has to go through the parliament. They could be like, okay, you could be the president, you could make any decision, but we have to approve it for that to happen, right? So they used to be considered as like very reasonably important people, members of the parliament at one point. The legislature was an important institute. Also, the money of the country is controlled by the legislature. You guys have heard of the budget, right? The annual budget, where the financial minister comes to the parliament and he reads the budget, and people in the parliament have to approve the budget. So that's when every institute of the country gets money from, right? Financial minister comes and says that, for defense, I'm going to spend this much. For education, I'm going to spend this much. In education, for A levels, I'm going to spend this much. To give away tabs, I'm going to spend this much, right? And the parliament has to approve. So since whatever the decision made by the executive, it should be approved by the legislature. And since it's the legislature that controls the finances of the country, that's why we normally say the legislature is the wallet of the country. We normally say legislature is the wallet of the country, right? And with that, the legislature had vast powers. However, in the recent times, this power has been reduced quite reasonably. And now the legislature does not have a very powerful role in terms of policy formation, right? That's for 3 reasons. It's there in the note. I will tell you anyway that you take down. First reason is the political party system. Okay. Second reason is members of the parliament lacking special knowledge. Okay. Third reason, members of the parliament not being able to practically implement the policies. If anyone wants to repeat, if anyone wants me to repeat, please tell me. Did anyone get that? Did everyone get that?
Could you repeat that, please?
You want to repeat it once?
Yes, please.
Okay. Number 1, the political party system. Number 2, members of the parliament lacking special skills or special knowledge. Number 3, members of the parliament not being able to practically implement policies. Number 1, political party system. Number 2, members of the parliament lacking special skills or special knowledge. And number 3, members of the parliament not being able to practically implement policies. Right. Now, what does this mean? First of all, political party system. What does this mean? Now, as I told you all before, when the executive makes a decision, when the executive makes a decision, the legislature has to approve, right? The legislature has to approve. But when it comes to that approval, because of the political party system, they are not always making a genuine decision. They are just going ahead with their political party's vision. Okay. Now, for example, think of this. For example, right? When Gotabaya Rajapaksa brings a policy to the parliament, right? Let's say President Rajapaksa brings a policy to the parliament. There will be nearly like more than 150 people who support Gotabaya's party. All of them are going to approve that policy. Do you think they have actually they've even read the policy properly? Do you think that it's because genuinely they think it's a good policy for the country? No, it's because the president is from their same party. So because it is their party, they are going to agree with it, right? What else? What about the other side, other aspect? Now, when it comes to Sajid's party, Samagi Jana Party, and JVP people and TNA people, whoever's in the opposition, they have opposite views. They are from the other side. They are from the opposite side of Gotabaya. So whenever Gotabaya brings a policy, all of them are going to vote against it. Do you think it's because genuinely that policy is a bad policy for the country and they care for the people? No, it's because simply because they are from the other party. That whatever the policy they bring, they are going to go against that, right? So this has been happening for so long that the members in the parliament who are supporting the government side, they would support anything brought out by the government, and the opposition, they would just go against anything brought out by the government. So people are not taking these parliamentary debates any serious anymore, right? Okay, you hear someone like Vimala Virvansha saying that this President Gotabaya's policy is really good. Like, is that like a surprise? Like, did you expect him to disagree with what the president brought in? Obviously, he's going to support them. If you see on news that someone like Sajid Premadas or one of his colleagues from Samagi Jana Party speaking against the Gotabaya's new rule, again, are you like even surprised? of course they are going to go against, they are not going to support. So people are aware of that. So because of that, people know that, first of all, people know that the policy is going to go through, it is going to be approved, because the majority of the people in the legislature are anyway supporters of the government. So they are not taking that approval seriously anyway. And secondly, even those debates, when they are debating, no one's taking that serious, because they know, of course, the opposition is going to say no, the government's going to say yes, right? That's the first reason. What is the second reason? The second reason is the members of the parliament lacking special skills, right? So what does that mean? These people are politicians, right? And I don't think it's going to be controversial for me to say that most of these people are not properly educated and not properly qualified, and they lack skills and knowledge, right? That is a stereotype of politicians, but that is a stereotype that actually makes some sense. You hardly see politicians who have proper education qualifications. They simply come to those places because, you know, they give away like free stuff and free food and stuff to these poor people, and they take the vote and they come to the parliament. So because of that, when it comes to policy formation, policy process, these people don't have the necessary skills to address the problems of the people have, right? So even when they're debating about something, some policy, whatever they bring up in that in their speeches are not, in fact, what do you call that? They don't even sound smart. They are not even talking about the proper issues. That's because they are lacking the proper knowledge, right? So because of that, again, no one takes the parliament and members of the parliament that serious, right? And the third one is the fact that the members of the parliament can't really do anything about practically implementing those decisions. The best they can do is making a decision. What they can do is like saying yes or no to an already made decision by the executive. Okay. So those are the reasons the legislature does not have like a major role in policy formation anymore, right? Because of that, we can mention that the legislature of a country have turned into the rubber stamp that provides approval to the decision of the executive. The parliament is simply a place. Now a policy just has to go through it, just like you have to take a detour and go in, get that rubber seal and come, right? No one takes that institute very seriously because they are not influential anymore because of those reasons, right? Then the role of the executive. The role of the executive is also, they've also lost their influence and their importance up to a certain extent, but not much. In fact, not much. Okay, that's because after all, they are the decision maker. The decision has to come from them. So because of that, the executive is somewhat considered important, right, in terms of the executive, because they are still the decision makers. But then again, the executive also has the problem, the same problem they also face, the same problem the legislature faces. The members of the executive not having the proper skills and proper knowledge, because these ministers, yet again, they are politicians, right? So they don't really have the awareness of what sort of problems people actually face and the technical knowledge as to how to address these problems. So because of that, these political executive, they are depending on the permanent executive as to how to approach these public problems, right? Now, for an example, let's say when it comes to farmers, right? The Minister of Agriculture may lack a little bit of proper knowledge as to what sort of problems farmers actually face. So he would ask his workers in the agriculture ministry, can you guys tell me what sort of decisions I should make? Because you guys have been working with the farmers for so long, and you guys actually go to the field and you guys carry out my decisions, right? So you guys should be having the proper knowledge. So the permanent executive, they have the proper skill and knowledge. So the um, they advise the political executive as to what decisions to be made. Okay. Then you have the judiciary. When you take the judiciary, those are the courthouses, right? So the courthouses don't really have like a necessarily an open role in terms of policy formation. What they have is actually a hidden role, more like a behind the scenes sort of a role. A lot of people don't even acknowledge that the judiciary takes part in policy formation process, but they do, right? How do they do that? Now, then again, as I always say, this is a short, brief explanation of this lesson. And this is like jumping to unit 11, and perhaps you guys are not aware of certain concepts. Now, if you guys were there from day one, if I started teaching by first lesson and I taught you, and if we gradually came to unit 11, you guys would have known something called judicial review power and judicial preview power. You know that, it's going to be easy for you to understand. In the simplest terms, guys, judicial review power means the judiciary stopping the executive from making a certain decision. The best example is Donald Trump in 2017 making a decision to deny visa for people coming from Iran, Iraq, and all those countries, and the judiciary stopping that law, saying no, you can't do that. So basically, they can stop a law. So they can stop a policy as well, right? They can't stop any law. They can stop it as long as it violates the constitution, right? So when the executive is making policies and the legislators approving that, if the judiciary feels like this particular policy is violating the constitution, they can quickly go and say like, here, you can't pass that. We are reversing that. That's called judicial review power. Review, R-E-V-I-E-V, review, right? Other than that, there's something called preview power. There's a P in front, preview power. So preview power is pretty much the same thing. The only difference is the judiciary has to stop it before the legislature approves that. That means if Gotabaya, like in Sri Lanka, that's what we have. Let's say Gotabaya makes a decision, he puts it to the parliament, and before the parliament approves that, judiciary has to stop it, right? Under review power, that even after when the parliament has passed that, the judiciary can stop it, right? So that's the main thing judiciary does in terms of policy formation, applying judicial review power or preview power. But now what the executives are actually doing is, in order to just to save themselves from unnecessary trouble, they ask it in the first place. Get it? In the very beginning. Now let's say I am the president. Let's say you guys are the members of the parliament, right? So when I'm making a policy, before I put it to the parliament, before I put it to you guys, I send it to the court. I send it to the chief justice or to the attorney general, and I ask, is this okay? Will you guys have to get involved and reverse this later on? Is this okay? Is there like a point that I violate the constitution or something? And the chief justice or the attorney general tell me like, no, this is okay. You have to change this part, you have to change that part. Then I change it to the parliament and I get it passed. That way we can save the trouble and the unnecessary expense and the time. Everything is in vain because we work so hard, and then the parliament comes, then the judiciary comes and stops it, right? So at the moment, that's what happens. The judiciary is acting like a consultant, like an advisor, that the executive clarifies whether is this okay to go before putting that to the parliament. Okay, so the judiciary, that's the role of the judiciary. Then, of course, when you take the permanent executive, it is quite important because, as I told you, they are the ones who carry out the decisions, and they are the ones who advise the political executive as to what to do. Right now, at one point, right, I will share a personal story with you guys. At one point, while I was in the university, I worked with the Minister of Justice. I worked there as an intern while I was in the final year of the university. So when I was working there, this was in 2015. Yeah, this was in 2015. So during that time, we just had the new government, and we just had a new cabinet, and under that cabinet, we had a cabinet for about 100 days, and in that cabinet, Mrs. Rosie Senanayake was the minister for child protection, right? She was particularly the Minister for Child Protection. So during this time, in like 2015, that was a time Snapchat was getting popular in Sri Lanka. Now, of course, it's a common thing, but Snapchat was coming to the popularity at the peak during that time. So with that, there was a huge problem of like girls' privacy being exploited by these bad ex-boyfriends and stuff. Like you guys understand, I'm talking about this leaking these sensitive content of girls, right? So it was there before, but we only had like Facebook and Instagram was okay. Instagram was there. It wasn't like advanced like these nowadays. And WhatsApp was there, and this whole leaking and like exploiting girls wasn't a huge issue because even the girls were a little hesitant about like sharing something like that, even with a boyfriend. Now, in 2015, there was like a boost of these cases because Snapchat came and Snapchat promoted themselves saying, you know, when you send a snap, it disappears in 24 hours. So it's safe for you to send it. So you can send anything. And even if they take a screenshot that you get a notification, so it will be there 24 hours, it's gone. You can't look at it twice, then you get the notification. It sounded safe at that time, right? So lot of instances were there of like photos being sent like that, and sometimes there were instances of guys switching off mobile data and putting it to like airplane mode and then taking a screenshot and the girl not knowing that, and like them using some other phone and like taking a picture of these. Like there were plenty of cases like that, and there was like a skyrocket of like, it just skyrocketed the incidences like that in 2015. So the ministry was concerned, the child protection ministry was concerned, and they organized a meeting as to do what to do with it. And since I was a younger person, younger generation person in the ministry, so they asked the child protection ministry asked the Minister of Justice to send two representatives from the Ministry of Justice, like people who knew about how the legal system works. So they decided to send me and my friend. My friend was he's just 3 years older. I think I was 24 back then. I was 24 and he was 27. And I was a law student. He was a law already, and we were sent there because we were sort of familiar with the younger generation and we knew what was going on and all. And there were people from telecom, there were people from dialogue to talk about how these things are shared. There were people from the science and like the technology department. There was a minister. There was two people from the ministry under the ministry which had the police, right, the law and order ministry, and two of us were there from justice ministry. Two people were there from the women's affairs ministry. So we were basically we were employees of the permanent executive, right? We were working for the permanent. We were carrying out the decisions of the political executive towards the people. And the minister, Rosie Saranaika, arranged that meeting. It was up to her to do something about this issue, but she did not have all the information she needed to make a decision by herself. So that's why she arranged that meeting. So for us to come together, and we prepared a report together and we provided it to her. So that's basically, as a member of the political executive, her asking us for advice. So what sort of a decision should I make here? Since you guys are more familiar with this, I would like to have your advice, right? So we prepared the note, which we sent to her, and she then put it to the cabinet, and then it went to the legislature. It was approved, it came, and that's how we currently have certain laws against these pictures being shared, right? And it basically we advised her, and she made the decision. It came back to us, and we implemented that, and that's how the lawmaking process works. So you can see that the permanent executive is very important. These public servants are very important. Not only that they carry out the decisions, they advise the political executive to make the decision themselves, right? So that's about permanent executive. Now we have to study about political parties and the civil society. Now, when it comes to political parties, how are they important in terms of policy formation, policy process? Now, first of all, if we go back to the first webinar we had on Monday, right? We studied that policies are created by political parties. They listen to the public and they create political. That's where everything begins. So basically, political parties pursue political power in elections. Whenever there's an election, when you have these people pasting posters and like doing campaigns and like coming from house to house and like giving away leaflets and pamphlets and all that, what are they doing? What basically are they doing? What are they asking for? Are they asking for money? Are they asking for money? Are they asking for donations? Are they asking for love? Are they asking for friendship? Why are they coming behind us? They're asking for us to vote for them, right? With vote, what do they get? They get the governmental power. Each guy who pays a poster is like asking us, please consider me as your decision maker. Please consider me as your policy decider, right? So if they are telling us, please appoint me as your government, please appoint me as your decision maker, you'll be like, what sort of decisions would you be making, provided that we appoint you? What sort of decisions, what sort of policies would you be making? Then every person, every party has to have like a book prepared, pre-prepared. This is my policy paper. These are the things I'm going to do if I ever become the leader of the country, or if I ever go to the parliament or whatever, right? So you can see an election is basically a chance for us as the voters to decide which policy paper works the best for us. In every election, we are given like a bunch of policy papers. We just have to pick the best one, right? Which means we already have like tons of policies and one of them gets approved. So which means that political executive I talked to you about, the decision makers, at one point they were a political party who already created a policy paper. And that's what lays the foundation for the agenda setting. Remember, in that policy cycle, agenda setting is created with the policy paper the political party has. Right? So you can see, first of all, political parties create policies, and those policies are the ones who will be put into the policy cycle, policy process cycle, if that political party wins the election. And what about the parties that don't win? Now, in the previous election, Gotabaya Rajapaksa had policies, Sajid Premadasa had policies, Anura Kumar Dissanayake had policies, and other parties, Ranil Wickremesinghe had policies. All the parties had their policies, and the majority of the people wanted Gotabaya Rajapaksa's policies to go ahead. So those policies are in effect at the moment, right? President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's policies, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa's policies, right? At the moment, they are policies of the political executive, but they started off. Those were started off as policies of Sri Lanka Podu Janaka. That's why we say that these parties are really important. And what about Sajid Premadasa and like Anura Kumar Dissanayake, the ones who did not get their policies approved? What about them? Well, although they did not get their policies approved, they are doing a job of being watchdogs, right? They are being watchdogs and they are closely observing whether Gotabaya is doing a good job with these policies. And if there's like slight error, those parties are going to point that out. They are doing that because they are expecting power. They are waiting to come to power the day Gotabaya runs out of power, right? So in a way, they are not necessarily doing that out of love for us. They are doing that for us to get power. That's a different story. But at the end of the day, that we have people to point at the government and to point out what they are doing wrong also. That's also because of political parties. So we can see that political parties are quite important in terms of policy formation, right? Then of course we need to study about civil society. Okay, right. So how important the civil society is in terms of policy formation? if you guys remember, we studied policy format, in the very first webinar, right? If you guys remember, civil society was the space in between, um, the state and your family, right? Your role as citizen and your role as a person. That space in between, if you remember the first webinar we had. Okay. So what sort of a role the civil society has in terms of this public policy? Now this note explains first what is the public sphere, what is the private sphere, and what is the civil sphere, right? If you remember that I had a sort of like a drawing for you all to understand this concept. I didn't really include the spheres, instead I use squares, right? But the idea is the same. First, you have the public sphere where you're acting as a citizen in the state. Then you have your private sphere where you are acting as a citizen. Sorry, where you're acting as a person with your personal duties. Then you have your civil sphere. That's a space in between that you can be politically active to win your rights. Okay. Now, if we talk about civil society, right? At one point, civil society was really important for one reason. Now, as I told you, see, this space, this in between space is free from the state influence. That means citizens can go there and fight for their rights. Okay, they can shout, they can protest for their political rights. Okay, so when it comes to policy making, also at one point it was used as a platform to voice out what areas the government, the state should look in, right? So farmers and everyone, let's say fishermen, or like there are any type of group which needed government's support, which needed government's approach to solve their problems. They had the civil society go out and voice out, saying, here, state, look, here, we have a problem, right? Please look into that. Please make a policy and approach this problem. We are having a problem here, right? That was the first use of the civil society in terms of policy formation, policy, public policy. That means that the state would look into civil society to understand that which areas they should be focusing on. But nowadays, in the recent times, they have become much more important. Now, we didn't really have much time to go into neoliberalism with that much of details on Tuesday. But I think I remember telling you that the state sort of like minimizes their tasks by outsourcing their tasks to other entities, such as private sector and NGOs. So the state gives its welfare activities to NGOs to make sure that they are done properly. Right? So these NGOs, and especially the civic organizations who are active in the civil society, since they spend so much time with the people, and since they spend so much time in the grassroots level, they are aware of what sort of problems people have, what sort of issues people have, and what should be done by the state to approach those. So because of that, the political executive I told you before, who seeks the advice from the public sector, the permanent executive, they seek advice from the civic organizations as well, NGOs as well. They come and ask the organization, the people in the civil society, hi guys, you guys are very familiar with these people and what sort of problems they have. Could you tell me what sort of policies I should be making? I would really like to have your input on this one. So because of that, these civic organizations have been really important, and civil society as well. Just to add to the previous real life example I came up with, in that meeting when we had regarding the protection of the privacy of girls, that meeting, there were several people from several people from a couple of NGOs as well, like for child protection and all that. There are several NGOs and civic organizations. Those people also there just to give their input with the knowledge they have, right? So those are things you need to know, and those are the institutes you all need to be familiar. For the exam, they might give a question from these areas. Now this time, I think they gave one question in the last exam. They gave one question for the last question. One of the subsections was policy formation and the role of executive, I think, last year, right? So they may give a different one this time, or they may give the same one again. You never know with officer, right? So that's what you need to be familiar. Right. So we will be moving on to the last part, which is Max Weber and his views on bureaucracy. Before that, any questions? No questions. Excellent. Right. Now you can see we have covered the theoretical aspect. We have covered the practical aspect. We only need to look into Max Weber's views. Right. Okay. So Max Weber is a really important political scientist when it comes to many areas, not just policy formation, right? But when it comes to policy formation itself, this person is really important because he explained what sort of things that needs to be there in bureaucracy. Okay. Public policy and bureaucracy. This is the unit. Explain how the word bureaucracy started, that it is a combination of like two Latin words and all that. Other than that, the basic way of defining what bureaucracy is, guys, basically a bureaucracy is that the totality, the entire collection of people and institutions related to the policy formation process. The term bureaucracy is like the term education, right? Now, education is like the collective term for like teachers, schools, textbooks, subjects, practicals, laboratories, examinations, results. Then everything is covered in one umbrella term called education. So it's like that. So you take all these departments, the individuals, hierarchies, these codes, rules, everything. When you put all those together, you can call it the bureaucracy, right? Okay. So Max Weber explains the term of bureaucracy, and Weber believes that the bureaucracy should have an authority over people, right? If you can read that, he believes that there are three types of authorities. You can read, it says the first one is traditional authority, second one is charismatic authority, third one is rational legal authority. Traditional authority, charismatic authority, and rational legal authority. Okay. So these are the three reasons Weber believe that they have authority. Okay. First of all, traditional authority. What does that mean? So when it comes to bureaucracy, someone who works for the government, we have so much of we are so much used to following what they say, right? Someone works for the government, comes and tells you something, right? If someone tells you like, okay, like if you are walking the payment this side of the payment, the policeman would be like, no, walking this side. You would follow that, And not necessarily because he's going to put you in prison or he's going to write you a fine for walking on that side, right? I'm talking about there are times policemen ask you to do something when you are like kind of breaking a law. But sometimes you're not necessarily breaking a law. A policeman would ask you to go this side because he feels like that's safer or he prefers that way. And you would follow that. And not necessarily because you're scared of going to prison. No, it's because since he's a police officer and a police officer gets that power from the state, right? The fact that they represent the state and they are the servants of the state is something that it makes us follow what they say, right? So they have an authority over us because they represent the state, right? And that's a tradition we've been brought up. We were born into that system. We grew up in that system where we've been following basically what these state servants, public servants tell us. So as a tradition, that we give them that authority. Second one is a charismatic authority. Now, when someone is working for the government, when someone is a member of the permanent executive, that sort of gives them a little bit of charisma, right? How does that work? Now that's why if you all have seen those newspaper marriage proposals, right? The first thing they mention is like the age, and they be like government employee. That's kind of the first thing they put, right? Pretty much in every marriage proposal on the newspaper. That's like a typical like a cliche. That's like the opening line, right? Raje Rakia hai, government employee, right? That's to show that they are working for the government. They are working a public sector job. That's because that sort of gives them a charisma over other people, and people tend to follow that because of that, because of the respect we have for the state and for them for being public servants. And third, of course, rational and legal authority. It's rational and it is legal to follow what they say because they represent the state and the state has sovereignty power. And they are the ones who have the authority in terms of a legal sense and a rational sense. So Weber believes that these are the reasons that they have the power. Right. Okay. Then when you move on, Weber believes that each hierarchy should have two important points. I think last time this was there for a short question. What are the two features Weber believes that should be there in a bureaucracy? Number one, hierarchy. Number two, division of labor. Right? Number one, hierarchy. Number two, division of labor. Right? What does this mean? First of all, hierarchy. A hierarchy is necessary to make sure that there is a proper flow of authority. Now we discussed that the bureaucracy has an authority. The people follow what they say, right? That's all right. But there is a small problem, isn't it? That authority has to properly flow. It has to have a proper flow, right? And if the people in the bureaucracy, if these public servants are equally powerful with like no one is being answerable to the other one, it is going to create a mess, right? Now, if any of you guys have like any family members in forces, Army, Navy, or Air Force, right? Even more than the police, in forces, even in police, it's kind of the same. The seniority is like a real, and they take that quite serious. So if the person is like higher in terms of the rank, that like they have to salute and they have to just do whatever they say without asking questions. You have to respect people who are above. That's because they have created that hierarchy, especially when you're fighting a war. People can't be fighting, the soldiers can't be fighting as how they believe. I feel like if we attack from this side, it's better. If your superior person says that go from this side, even if you feel like okay, going from this side is like the best option, but you are supposed to follow what your superior officer, commanding officer says, and that's like something that they've created. So there's a proper flow of authority. Now, if the president, who's like the highest commanding officer of the armed forces, if he says that go this way, it comes down to the army commander, comes down to whoever that's below, then what's below, the next level, and it comes to the soldiers, and the soldiers have to go forward, right? Then only there's a proper flow. If there's someone in the middle who's like, you know what, I'm not gonna follow that. And from that point onwards, it would not, that authority would not flow. There's a break in the flow. So even in the hierarchy, even in the bureaucracy, this hierarchy is really important for that authority to properly flow. Otherwise, what the government decides won't be properly carried out. Okay. So every member in the hierarchy should know who they are responsible to, and who is responsible to them. Okay. That's how it works in a school, right? It's not exactly how it works, but let's say now, if you all are students and I'm your teacher, the class teacher, right? You guys are responsible to me, and I am responsible to the sectional head. The sectional head is responsible to the principal. Okay, so that's like a hierarchy. So the authority would properly flow. So in a bureaucracy also, that hierarchy is a must. Weber says it has to be there. Everyone should know who they are answerable to and who's answerable to them. So that way, you know which orders you should follow, which orders coming from where, that the ones you should be following, and which ones to like give the orders to. Okay, if not everyone's giving orders to everyone and no one's listening to anyone's orders, it won't work properly. It's going to be a huge mess. Then the second one, division of labor. Weber further believes that you have to divide. You have to divide the labor into the proper departments in order uh, to carry out the tasks more efficient. Okay, this is the division. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that when you are employing someone, when you are recruiting someone to the bureaucracy, you need to identify what that person's skills are. Okay. Now imagine, let's say I recruit one of you. The person is really good with accounts, right? Now imagine I recruit 3 people from, right? One of you all is like really good with accounts, but the communication skills are not the best. Someone who doesn't really make eye contact with others, who doesn't really speak that loud for others to hear, who's very shy, who's very introvert, right? But top notch with the account skills, right? Let's say when I recruit the person, I look at the staff and I'm like, there's a vacancy in the PR team, like the marketing team. So I'm going to put you to the marketing team because there's a vacancy, right? And I'm going to put this person who doesn't even properly make eye contact to my marketing team, who's supposed to go out and talk to people and convince people and all that, right? Then comes someone else, right? Then comes someone else who's capable of doing field. Let's say a guy from this class comes who can travel throughout the uh, country and carry out whatever the task, like going off field, going out station, staying for days, and like doing all that. Then I'm going to look at this thing and I'm going to see, yeah, one person has left the accounts department. But like, there's a vacancy in the accounts department, I'm going to put you there. Now, this guy who's capable of going out and like doing all these duties, who's not very fluent in accounts, is working in the accounts department, right? And then another girl comes who's like very good in like her debating skills and he was the captain of the debating team or something like that, and who's really good in comparing and like speaking to people, convincing people. It's really good in PR. And I'm like, okay, one person has left the outstation and going out that field team. I'm gonna put you to the field. Who's not very comfortable going out and like uh, uh, even when you go out, you have to return on the same day. So you just have to do everything on the same day without taking your time and doing a proper job. Now, my department is going to be an entire mess. The person who's working in the marketing team is not going to do the marketing properly, right? She should have done well as an accountant, but the account department has this guy who's very slow in his accounts, and he would have done really well going outstation and taking his time, staying a couple weeks and finishing that work properly. But I have put this girl there who goes and returns on the same day because she's not comfortable staying outstation and she's not doing that job properly. And she would have done way better in the marketing team, and she would have made sure the marketing is done properly. Right? So when you're employing people, you shouldn't be just looking at what vacancies there, I'm going to put it there. You need to be smart and you have to divide the labor properly. Right? On the other hand, let's say that I recruit the three of you all and I'm going to put you all there saying, guys, you all have to do marketing, you all have to do accounts, and you have to go outstation and do duty. Right? So I'm going to get three of you all to do all three. Again, not going to work. Right? I need to figure out which department suits for which person. That way I can make sure the efficiency is right. So in order to create the efficiency and everything going on, division of labor is really important. And if you go through the mod, you can see a couple of features that Mr. Weber explained, the common features of a hierarchy. Not a hierarchy, a bureaucracy. Okay. So basically, Weber mentioned the mutual characteristics of a bureaucracy. Number one, it is a system of office holders or a bureaucracy with power and authority to perform certain functions. Number two, distribution of functions among officers is done based on a division of labor. Number three, organization of a hierarchy in which authority distribution from higher to lower level officials. Number four, each level of officials have power and the authority given by law to perform the relevant functions and responsibilities. Okay. So those are the mutual characteristics. Other than that, there are two more, which are basic explanations of a bureau. Right. So that's about policy formation. Now I need to remind you guys that as I told you before, this is a very theoretical lesson. Now, one thing I noticed that some of the people who were there at the beginning of the class, in the midpoint they've left. Perhaps it wasn't interesting as the other few lessons we studied before. As I told you, this is the reason. This is one of the reasons that this lesson is very much overlooked when they are taught in certain places. Whenever some people teach, they tend to overlook this lesson and they would just give a random note and just move on. As you can see, it's very theoretical, and you have to be very clear with the principles, right? First of all, if you feel like this, you're not fully comfortable with this lesson, like the lessons that we covered before. Firstly, it's because this is very theoretical, unlike other lessons, right? So it's not that hasty, that political flavor you have in other lessons, you don't really have in this one. This is more like an administration, state administration sort of a subject rather than practical politics, right? Secondly, it's because, as always, I had to cover everything in a very short period of time. This is ideally like I should be taking like 6 hours, 3 classes. I would take 3 days to cover these 3 main areas I told you about. So if that's the case, I would have taken an entire class, 2 hours, 3 hours to explain the theoretical aspect of it, 2 hours, 3 hours to explain the practical aspect of it, like the institutions and all, and 2 hours, 3 hours to explain what Weber has taught about this. So if that was the case, it would have been much easier for you to process. And of course, the last reason is the fact that some of you all haven't really done the earlier lessons, the basic lessons. So because of that, also sometimes you are lacking the bricks to do the proper construction. And I tried my best to explain the basics in a nutshell, but perhaps I would have found it a little uncomfortable to process these points without really being familiar with the earlier lessons. Okay. Right. So that's about policy formation. And guys can study. The moment I get my type note, I shall share it with you all. You all can just take a printout of this and study that and let me know if you have any questions.